Photography for me is sort of a medium built around conceptual tensions. My work has always sort of linked both analog and digital devices as a way of, I guess, of sort of enhancing the contradictory, the paradoxical possibilities of the photographic image as something that often moves between the factual and the fictional, the concrete and the metaphorical. In the last 5-6 years, perhaps a little bit more, I've focused a great deal on sort of hard-to-access environments, what I term hard-to-access environments, because I'm genuinely interested in the sort of techniques of artistic expression that these sort of engagements activate. From 2010 through 2014, I worked a lot with sort of technological organizations. I worked with various nuclear power stations, hydropower stations. I've worked with institutions like the European Space Agency, and of course this was the work that was at Format this year. It was the first time that the European Space Agency opened its doors to a visual practitioner. In 2009, I discovered that the Arts Catalyst in London had been commissioned by the European Space Agency to produce a report on the viability of the cultural utilization of space, microgravity, space exploration, and so on. Nothing really concrete resulted from this consultation, and I remember thinking whether perhaps trying to engage with the arts was a step too quickly for an organization like the European Space Agency, who didn't have a culture of dealing with artists. Even NASA were disappointed when their first artist in residence, performative artist Laurie Anderson, when she decided to present a poem to reflect her time there.
I said, now, what does an artist in residence actually do? I mean, what does that mean with the space program? And they said they didn't really know what that meant, and what did I think it meant? And I thought, who are these people? Excuse me. Can you tell me where I am?
It's public record that some officials had expected her to do something much more technological, like bounce a beam of laser off the moon or something of the sort. And this was even echoed by government, particularly an Indiana Republican, a gentleman called Chris Shikola, who later that year moved to amend a science appropriation bill so that he would stop NASA from never again trying to make sort of science fun and interesting. But the point was, as photography is much more mediatic, I thought to myself that this might have actually been a better medium to try and engage with an organization like this. The marriage of photography and space exploration already had a record in sort of mobilizing audiences. And if we think of the Earthrise picture, which was taken by NASA astronaut Bill Anders, and how this one image was responsible for mobilizing a whole generation of people. So I was confident that photography was really the right medium to approach an organization like the European Space Agency. And so between 2014 and 2016 I produced this incredible project where I traveled all over the world, visited more than 20 different locations in over 9 different countries. And that's the project that we ended up presenting this year at the Format Festival. Up until then, the only contact that many of these scientists had with people working with photography would have probably have been with journalists accompanying launches and so on. So the access that most journalists get to a lot of these spaces is very, very limited. They're not allowed to go inside the clean rooms. They're not allowed to be a touching distance from these billion-dollar developments. And I had to try and explain to them why this project was different and why it is that I had to be inside these spaces, facing my object within touching distance of them. The first thing I did was I wrote to them a very comprehensive proposal. I did my research and I told them that I wanted to sort of critically engage with a variety of their programs, sort of the lunar, the Mars exploration programs, the microgravity, the integrated biological systems for, sort of space missions. There was a whole list of sort of interesting programs that I wanted to try and engage with. And then the plan became to try and engage with people at these facilities to see whether there were other locations that they would suggest I visited, to try and really start thinking very much like sort of a scientist, if you like. I also had to try and explain to them why I work the way I do, because I still work with sort of a plate film cameras, sort of large film cameras. where you have to put a cloth over your head in order to be able to sort of focus on your subject matter. And of course this intrigued them, because it's the polar opposite of what they're doing there. They're doing cutting-edge photography, and I'm working in a very archaic manner, if you like, using very long exposures of up to an hour and so on. But paradoxically, the way I work actually engaged them, because they were curious about what I was doing. So I went around their jet propulsion and material components labs looking for items that I thought were sort of interesting. At first, I engaged with them purely at an artistic and sort of visual level. I went around with a shopping trolley, believe it or not, sort of collecting a whole host of different objects. And then what I did, once I had this sort of collection of objects, is I sat down with various different scientists and engineers, and we started talking about, sort of the importance of a lot of these objects. I selected about 10 that actually ended up forming part of the book and the exhibitions and so on. 2 of which are the ones that I've got here in my studio. So one of the objects that you have there is what they call sort of a honeycomb assembly. This object, if you like, is absolutely crucial in space exploration. This material forms part of all sorts of structures and of insulation for the space shuttle. All solar panels are made of this sort of material, so it's very rigid, very strong, but also very, very light. The one on the left is quite an interesting one, because it's a stainless steel reflector, which is what they use a great deal in satellites and all sorts of space objects, to bounce beams of lasers off them and so on. So it's absolutely crucial, again, in the context of sort of space exploration. But the interesting thing is that the sort of reflection on the mirror in a way looked a little bit like a sunset or sunrise, or perhaps the very edge of the atmosphere. I work with large format cameras, partly because of the detail, but partly because it's a much more introspective medium. So you have to put the camera on a tripod. It takes me about sort of an hour to set up, sort of look at perspectives, correct perspectives, and so on. So because it actually slows everything down, it really makes you think about what you're doing a lot more. So, you're not just really clicking and photographing things. You're really thinking about why you're photographing something. Is it worth even photographing it? I photographed this thing called the Large Space Simulator, which is where they effectively recreate the vacuum of space. And that's one of the images that was actually shown at Format. And for example, the Large Space Simulator is a multi-million-dollar facility. They have never had people outside ESA walk into the Large Space Simulator. And that's a very good example of an image that had to be taken 3 times, because I'm shooting almost in pitch darkness. I'm standing the tripod on some rickety stairs, trying not to sneeze, trying not to move. The first time I went there, I got an idea of how much I thought the exposure should be, I did something like 50, 60 manual handheld flashes, came back to London, processed the image, and realized that actually, half of the image was still too dark. Then went back again a year later to rephotograph it, and it was still not enough. So I went back a 3rd time to rephotograph the image. So that image is a perfect example of sort of my commitment to be able to, I suppose, working the way I do. My strategy, if you like, was to try and create a body of work that not only documented the scientific and historic value of a lot of the places and objects I visited, but also their metaphorical resonance, their sort of poetic derivations. I was interested in things that sort of opened up new levels of meaning, new levels of interpretation.